The blood splattered across the wooden fence post like crimson paint against weathered pine, and Sarah Mackenzie knew this time was different. Her knees buckled as another violent coughing fit seized her lungs, sending more scarlet droplets into the morning dust of her failing homestead. 23 years old and already feeling death's cold fingers creeping up her spine, she pressed her trembling hand against the rough bark of the oak tree her father had planted the year she was born, back when this patch of Colorado territory held promise instead of desperation. The autumn wind of 1887 carried the scent of dying grass across the 40 acres that had once been the pride of the Mackenzie family, but now stood as a monument to dreams turned to dust. Sarah's father had died 3 winters ago from a horse kick to the chest, and her mother had followed him into the ground just months later, claimed by the same consumption that now ravaged Sarah's lungs. The homestead that had supported a family of 4 now struggled to sustain one dying woman who refused to abandon the only life she had ever known. She wiped the blood from her lips with a torn piece of calico that had once been part of her Sunday dress, now reduced to rags like everything else on the property. The mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks, and Sheriff Morrison had made it clear during his last visit that the bank would not extend any more grace periods. Sarah had watched her neighbors lose their claims one by one throughout the summer, their belongings loaded onto wagons that disappeared into the vast emptiness of the frontier, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of cabins and broken dreams. Her remaining livestock consisted of 3 scrawny chickens, a milk cow whose output had dwindled to barely enough for Sarah's own survival, and an old mare named Duchess who had seen better decades. The vegetable garden that had once provided abundance now yielded only enough turnips and potatoes to keep Sarah from starving, and even those were beginning to rot in the early frost that had arrived weeks ahead of schedule. She had sold everything of value months ago, including her mother's wedding ring and her father's hunting rifle, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the few coins hidden in a tin can beneath the loose floorboard under her bed. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Sarah straighten despite the pain in her chest, and she quickly tucked the blood-stained cloth into her apron pocket. Visitors were rare these days, and she had learned to be cautious of strangers who might be scouting properties for the bank or worse. Through the morning haze, she could make out a single rider approaching slowly, hunched forward in his saddle as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. As the figure drew closer, Sarah realized it was an elderly man dressed in clothes that had seen far too many miles and too much weather. The stranger's horse was as worn as its rider, a bay gelding with ribs showing through its dull coat and a gait that spoke of exhaustion rather than spirit. The man himself appeared to be somewhere past 60, with long gray hair that hung in unkempt tangles beneath a battered hat that might have once been black. His coat was patched in multiple places, and his boots had holes that allowed his toes to peek through like secrets he could no longer hide. When he finally reached Sarah's fence line, he stopped his horse and looked at her with eyes that held depths she could not immediately fathom. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice carrying the roughness of someone who had spent years breathing dust and speaking to no one but horses. "I wonder if you might spare a drink of water for an old traveler and his mount. We've been riding since before dawn, and the nearest town is still half a day's journey ahead." There was something in his manner that suggested education beneath the rough exterior, a careful way of speaking that seemed at odds with his bedraggled appearance. Sarah felt another cough building in her chest and fought to suppress it, not wanting to display weakness before this stranger whose intentions remained unclear. "Water's free to anyone who asks politely," she managed, gesturing toward the well near the cabin. "Though I should warn you, it's got a taste of iron to it. The bucket's hanging on the post there." She studied his face as he dismounted, noting the way he moved with careful deliberation, as if every motion required conscious thought. As the old man led his horse to the well, Sarah noticed something odd about the way he handled himself. Despite his ragged appearance, there was an underlying precision to his movements, a bearing that spoke of military training or at least a life lived under discipline. He drew water for his horse first, holding the bucket steady while the animal drank deeply, then filled it again for himself. The way he cupped the water in his hands and drank suggested someone who had known both plenty and privation, appreciating the simple gift of clean water. "Fine water," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Iron taste just means it's honest water, drawn from deep in the earth where it's had time to learn the truth about the land." He looked around the homestead with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, from the sagging roof of the cabin to the empty fields that should have been harvested by now. "This is good land. Hard to work, but good land nonetheless." Something in his tone made Sarah's chest tighten with more than just the consumption that was slowly killing her. Was good land, she corrected, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Now it's just another piece of ground that's going back to the bank come next month. Nothing I can do about it now except watch it happen. The admission felt like another kind of death, the final acknowledgement that her family's legacy would end with her. The old man's eyes sharpened slightly, and for a moment Sarah caught a glimpse of something that seemed incongruous with his vagrant appearance. Banks are hard masters, he said quietly. I've seen good people lose everything to banks that never worked a day in the dirt or felt the heartbreak of a failed crop. Sometimes I think the worst enemy of the common folk isn't Indians or outlaws, but men in clean suits who never calloused their hands. There was an underlying anger in his voice that suggested personal experience with such losses. Sarah felt another coughing fit approaching and turned away, hoping to hide the blood she knew would come. But this attack was worse than the morning's, and despite her efforts, she found herself doubled over, retching crimson onto the dry earth while her lungs felt like they were being torn apart from the inside. When the spasm finally passed, she looked up to find the old man watching her with an expression of deep concern rather than the disgust or fear she had grown accustomed to seeing on people's faces. Consumption, she said simply, wiping her mouth and straightening as much as her damaged body would allow. Started last spring, getting worse every week. Figure I've got maybe till Christmas if I'm lucky, maybe not that long if this cold weather keeps up. She met his gaze directly, refusing to show the fear that gnawed at her in the dark hours before dawn. Doesn't matter much anyway, since the land's going back to the bank whether I'm alive to see it or not. The stranger was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable. There was something in his weathered face that suggested he was calculating odds and possibilities, weighing factors she could not even guess at. Finally, he spoke, and his words carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to their simple meaning. A person never knows what tomorrow might bring. I've seen fortunes change overnight, seen the desperate find hope where none seemed to exist, seen the dead walk away from their own funerals. Sarah laughed, but the sound came out as more of a bitter rasp. Mister, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm dealing with two kinds of death here. The kind that's eating me from the inside out, and the kind that's coming to take my land. Neither one seems likely to change its mind just because an old stranger tells me to keep hoping. She gestured toward her failing homestead with hands that trembled slightly from weakness. Hope's a luxury I can't afford anymore. Maybe so, the old man said, reaching into his saddlebags and pulling out a small leather pouch. From it, he withdrew what appeared to be a few coins, though Sarah could not see their denomination from where she stood. But sometimes hope comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes kindness finds its way back to the person who showed it first, even when they thought nobody was watching. He held out his hand toward Sarah, the coins glinting dully in the morning light. Sarah stared at the offered money, her mind racing with confusion and suspicion. I can't take your coins, mister. You look like you need them more than I do, and besides, I haven't done anything to earn them. Giving a drink of well water isn't worth payment from someone who's clearly traveling hard times himself. She took a step backward, her pride warring with the desperate need that gnawed at her daily. Sometimes, the old man said, his voice taking on a tone that seemed to carry echoes of authority, the greatest service one person can provide to another is simply treating them with basic human dignity. You offered water to a stranger without asking questions or demanding payment. You spoke truthfully about your circumstances without begging or trying to manipulate sympathy. In my experience, such simple honesty is rarer than gold nuggets and more valuable than most people realize. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the barren fields and rattling the loose boards of Sarah's cabin. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice echoing across the empty landscape like a lament for all the dreams that had died in this unforgiving country. Sarah felt another wave of weakness wash over her, and she gripped the fence post for support, tasting copper in her mouth that warned of another coughing fit approaching. Keep your money, she said finally, though the words cost her more than the stranger could possibly know. But I thank you for the kind words. They're worth more than coins to someone in my situation. She managed a weak smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You should probably be moving along if you want to reach town before dark. The trail gets treacherous once the sun goes down, and there are wolves that hunt these parts after nightfall. The old man studied her for another long moment, then slowly returned the coins to his pouch. But instead of mounting his horse immediately, he walked closer to where Sarah stood, moving with that same careful precision she had noticed earlier. When he was close enough that she could see the deep lines etched by weather and hardship around his eyes, he spoke in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. "What's your name, miss?" he asked, and something in his tone suggested the answer mattered more than simple politeness would dictate. "Sarah Mackenzie," she replied, wondering why her heart had begun beating faster despite her weakened condition. "This was my father's claim, Thomas Mackenzie. He filed it back in 1878, right after the silver strikes brought folks flooding into this territory." She gestured toward the weathered headstone visible behind the cabin. "He's buried there beside my mother, Martha. They both loved this land more than life itself." "Sarah Mackenzie," the old man repeated, as if committing the name to memory for reasons she could not fathom. "And what would you do, Sarah Mackenzie, if someone offered you a chance to keep this land? Not charity, mind you, but an honest opportunity to earn what you need to pay the bank and maybe get some medical attention for that cough?" His eyes never left hers as he spoke, and Sarah felt as if he were looking straight through to her soul. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow, stirring hopes she had thought permanently buried beneath the weight of harsh reality. "I'd ask what kind of work they had in mind," she said carefully, "and what price they expected me to pay for such an opportunity. In my experience, offers that sound too good to be true usually are, and desperate people make easy targets for those who prey on hope." Her voice carried years of hard-earned wariness. The old man nodded approvingly, as if her caution pleased rather than offended him. A wise answer from someone who's learned to survive in hard country. "I respect that kind of careful thinking." He glanced toward the horizon where storm clouds were beginning to gather, then back to Sarah's face. "But sometimes, Sarah Mackenzie, the most impossible things turn out to be the most true. Sometimes the stranger on the road turns out to be exactly what you need, even when you don't know you need it." Before Sarah could respond, another violent coughing fit seized her, this one so severe that she collapsed to her knees in the dirt, blood flowing freely from her lips as her lungs felt like they were being shredded from within. Through the haze of pain and oxygen deprivation, she was dimly aware of the old man's hand supporting her shoulders, holding her steady until the spasm passed. When she could finally breathe again, she found herself looking up into eyes that held depths of compassion she had not seen in months. "Easy now," he murmured, helping her back to her feet with surprising strength for someone of his apparent age and condition. "That's a hard cough you're carrying. How long since you've seen a doctor?" His voice carried genuine concern, and Sarah realized that despite his ragged appearance, there was something about this stranger that inspired trust in a way she could not explain. "Can't afford a doctor," Sarah admitted, wiping blood from her chin with shaking hands. "Last one I saw was in Denver City, back in the spring when the cough first started getting bad. He told me what I already knew, that consumption was eating me alive, and then charged me $2 for the privilege of hearing it said out loud. Haven't had $2 to spare since then." The admission burned almost as much as the constant pain in her chest. The old man was quiet for several minutes, appearing to wrestle with some internal decision that weighed heavily on his mind. Finally, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small object that caught the light strangely. Sarah realized it was a compass, but not the simple brass instrument she might have expected from a drifter. This was silver, ornately carved, with markings that suggested military origin. "Sarah Mackenzie," he said, holding the compass so she could see it clearly, "I'm going to ask you to do something that might seem foolish, but I want you to trust me. Tomorrow morning, at sunrise, I want you to ride into town and go to the bank. Tell them you're ready to negotiate terms for keeping your land. Don't accept their first offer, don't let them pressure you into signing anything quickly. Just tell them you need time to consider your options." Sarah stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "Mister, I appreciate whatever game you're playing, but I don't have anything to negotiate with. The bank doesn't care about my circumstances or my family history. They want their money, and when I can't pay it, they want my land. It's that simple." She felt tears threatening to spill over, tears of frustration and grief and the bitter knowledge that hope was a poison that only made dying harder. Trust me, the old man repeated, pocketing the compass and mounting his weary horse with movements that seemed more fluid and confident than they had when he first arrived. Sometimes the most important battles are won by people who refuse to surrender even when defeat seems certain. You've got fight left in you, Sarah Mackenzie, more than you know. He gathered his reins and looked down at her with an expression she could not read. As he prepared to ride away, Sarah felt compelled to call out to him. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying across the morning air. "I don't even know your name. If I'm going to trust a stranger with my last hope, should at least know what to call you." There was something about his departure that felt significant, as if this moment would prove to be a turning point she did not yet understand. The old man paused and turned back toward her, and for just an instant, Sarah thought she saw something flicker across his features that transformed his entire appearance. It was as if a mask had slipped, revealing glimpses of someone entirely different beneath the ragged exterior. "Name's Mitchell," he said quietly. "Colonel James Mitchell, though I haven't used that title in longer than I care to remember. And Sarah Mackenzie, I have a feeling our paths will cross again sooner than you might expect." With that, he rode away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the dust of her dying homestead, clutching questions she could not answer and nursing a spark of hope she was afraid to acknowledge. The blood in her mouth had stopped flowing, but the taste of copper lingered as she watched the mysterious Colonel Mitchell disappear into the vast emptiness of the Colorado Territory, carrying secrets that might hold the key to her survival or might simply be the delusions of a dying woman grasping at shadows. 3 days had passed since the encounter with the mysterious Colonel Mitchell, and Sarah Mackenzie found herself standing before the imposing brick facade of First National Bank of Durango, clutching the reins of her aging mare Duchess with hands that trembled from more than just the morning cold. The coughing fits had grown worse during the intervening nights, leaving her so weak that she had barely managed to saddle her horse for the journey into town. Every breath felt like drawing air through broken glass, and the metallic taste of blood had become her constant companion. The bank building stood 3 stories tall, its red brick walls and ornate stonework a testament to the wealth that flowed through this frontier town built on silver mining and cattle ranching. Cast iron columns flanked the heavy oak doors, and brass fixtures gleamed despite the dusty Colorado wind that seemed to coat everything else in a fine layer of grit. Sarah had been inside exactly twice before, once when her father had originally secured the mortgage, and once the previous spring when she had tried desperately to negotiate an extension on her payments. Both visits had ended in humiliation and disappointment. She tied Duchess to the hitching post and paused to steel herself against another wave of weakness that threatened to buckle her knees. The few passers-by on the wooden sidewalk gave her a wide berth, their eyes filled with the mixture of pity and fear that had become familiar whenever people noticed her condition. Consumption was a disease that marked its victims as clearly as a brand, and decent folks knew better than to get too close to someone who might breathe death into their lungs. The bank's interior was all dark wood and brass fittings, designed to project an air of permanence and respectability that felt as foreign to Sarah as a palace would have seemed. Behind the marble-topped counter, clerks in clean white shirts and black sleeve garters moved with the efficient precision of men who dealt in other people's dreams and failures on a daily basis. The air smelled of ink, leather, and the faint aroma of tobacco from the private offices where the real decisions were made. "Miss Mackenzie," came a voice from across the lobby, and Sarah turned to see Harold Bancroft, the bank president, emerging from his corner office. He was a small, meticulously groomed man in his 50s, with thinning hair combed across his scalp and a gold watch chain that stretched across his substantial belly. His expression carried the practiced sympathy of someone who had delivered bad news to desperate people more times than he cared to count. "I must say I'm surprised to see you here. Sheriff Morrison indicated that you had accepted the inevitability of foreclosure proceedings." Sarah straightened her shoulders despite the pain in her chest and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Bancroft, I've come to discuss terms for keeping my land. I believe there might be options we haven't fully explored." The words felt strange in her mouth, particularly since she had no idea what those options might be. But something in Colonel Mitchell's manner had convinced her that this conversation was more important than it appeared. Bancroft's eyebrows rose slightly, and he gestured toward his office with the air of a man indulging a child's fantasy. "By all means, Miss Mackenzie, let us discuss whatever terms you believe might be available. Though I should warn you that the bank's position has not changed since our last conversation. Your account is severely in arrears, and we have other interested parties prepared to purchase the property immediately upon foreclosure. The office was even more intimidating than the main lobby, with heavy leather furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced men who had probably never worked a day of physical labor in their lives, and shelves lined with law books that Sarah could not have afforded to own, much less understand. Bancroft settled behind his massive desk and opened a leather-bound ledger that contained the details of her family's financial destruction laid out in neat columns of figures. "Let me be direct, Miss Mackenzie," he said, running his finger down a page of entries. "Your current debt to this institution stands at $843, including accumulated interest and penalties. Your property, while well-maintained in better times, has deteriorated significantly and would likely bring no more than $600 at auction in the current market. Even if you were to sell every asset you possess, you would still owe this bank a substantial sum." Sarah felt her heart sinking as the cold mathematics of her situation were laid bare, but she forced herself to remember Colonel Mitchell's words about refusing to surrender even when defeat seemed certain. "What would it take to bring the account current and give me time to rebuild?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be far beyond her reach. "Complete payment of the outstanding balance, plus a demonstration of your ability to maintain regular payments going forward," Bancroft replied without hesitation. "Given your current circumstances and health condition, I'm afraid the bank cannot see any reasonable prospect of such a resolution." His tone was not unkind, but it carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. At that moment, there was a soft knock on the office door, followed by the entry of Bancroft's chief clerk, a nervous man named Silas who normally moved with the quick, fearful motions of someone who lived in constant dread of making mistakes. Today, however, there was something different about his demeanor, an excitement that he was clearly struggling to contain. "Mr. Bancroft, sir," Silas said, his voice carrying an odd tremor, "there's a gentleman here to see you about the Mackenzie account. He says he's acting as Miss Mackenzie's representative in a financial matter." The clerk's eyes darted between his employer and Sarah with an expression that suggested he was witnessing something unprecedented in his years of banking experience. Bancroft frowned and consulted his appointment book. "I have no record of any scheduled meetings regarding this account. Did this gentleman provide his name and credentials?" There was irritation in his voice at having his carefully planned day disrupted by unexpected visitors. "Yes, sir," Silas replied, producing a calling card from his vest pocket and handing it to his employer with hands that shook slightly. "He's waiting in the main lobby, and he asked me to give you this." He also handed Bancroft a sealed envelope, heavy with expensive paper and bearing an unfamiliar seal pressed in dark blue wax. Sarah watched as Bancroft's expression changed dramatically while reading first the calling card and then the contents of the envelope. The banker's face went through a series of transformations: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked remarkably like fear. He read the letter twice, his lips moving silently, before looking up at Sarah with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "Miss Mackenzie," he said carefully, "it appears that your situation has become considerably more complicated than either of us realized. Your representative has made some rather extraordinary claims, and he's provided documentation that I need to examine more carefully. Would you excuse me for a few minutes while I speak with this gentleman privately?" Sarah nodded, though her mind was reeling with questions she could not even begin to formulate. Through the frosted glass door of Bancroft's office, she could hear the murmur of voices, though she could not make out individual words. One voice was clearly Bancroft's, pitched higher than usual with what sounded like nervous energy. The other voice was lower, more measured, and something about its cadence seemed familiar though she could not immediately place it. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which Sarah found herself fighting off waves of dizziness and nausea that seemed to be getting worse by the hour. She had not eaten anything substantial in 2 days, partly because food had lost its appeal and partly because her few remaining supplies needed to last as long as possible. The coughing fits were coming more frequently now, and she had taken to carrying a handkerchief that she kept pressed to her lips almost constantly. When the office door finally opened, Sarah looked up to see Bancroft returning with an expression of barely contained astonishment, followed by a figure that made her heart nearly stop beating. It was Colonel Mitchell, but he looked entirely different from the ragged drifter who had visited her homestead 3 days earlier. Gone were the patched clothes and worn boots, replaced by a perfectly tailored black suit, polished leather shoes, and a gold watch chain that rivaled Bancroft's own. His hair had been trimmed and combed, and his bearing carried the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to having his words carry weight in rooms like this one. "Miss Sarah Mackenzie," he said, with a slight bow that seemed to carry more respect than anything Sarah had experienced in months, "I believe we need to have a conversation about your future." His eyes held the same depth she remembered, but now they were framed by an entirely different context that made her question everything she thought she understood about their previous encounter. Bancroft resumed his seat behind the desk, but his entire demeanor had changed. Where before he had projected the comfortable authority of a man holding all the cards, now he seemed nervous and deferential, like a junior clerk reporting to a superior. "Miss Mackenzie," he said, "it appears that you have some very influential friends. Your account status is going to require some significant adjustments based on new information that has come to light." Sarah looked back and forth between the two men, feeling as if she had stumbled into a play where everyone knew their roles except her. "Colonel Mitchell," she said slowly, "I don't understand what's happening here. 3 days ago you were asking me for water for your horse, and now you're sitting in a bank president's office dressed like you own half the territory. What kind of game are you playing?" Mitchell leaned forward in his chair, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the same man who had shown her such unexpected kindness on that desperate morning at her homestead. "No game, Sarah. Just a very old man trying to figure out whether there are still good people left in this world, and what he should do when he finds one." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio that he opened to reveal documents bearing official seals and signatures. "My full name is James Hamilton Mitchell, Colonel, retired, United States Army Corps of Engineers. I've spent the last 15 years investing in mining operations, railroad construction, and land development throughout Colorado Territory. I am, by most measures, what people call a wealthy man." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she felt herself sinking back into her chair as the implications began to register. "But why?" she managed to ask. "Why the disguise? Why test me like that? And why are you here now?" "Because," Mitchell said quietly, "I've learned that money changes people, and not usually for the better. I've watched men I once respected become grasping and cruel when they thought there was profit to be made. I've seen women who were raised to be decent Christian ladies turn their backs on suffering when it became inconvenient to their social standing. After my wife died 5 years ago, I decided to find out whether there were still people in this territory who would show kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return." He gestured toward the documents spread across Bancroft's desk. "I've been traveling through small communities, presenting myself as a drifter or a down-on-his-luck prospector, looking for people who would offer help to someone who appeared to have nothing to give in return. In 3 years of testing, you are the first person who not only offered assistance but refused payment for it. The first person who chose generosity even when it meant taking food out of your own mouth." Sarah felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks, partly from relief and partly from the overwhelming realization of how close she had come to losing everything. "But I still don't understand what this means for my situation. The debt is still real, my land is still mortgaged, and I'm still dying of consumption. Your kindness doesn't change any of that." Mitchell smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, it was the smile of a man who held the power to change lives. "Actually, it changes all of it. Mr. Bancroft, would you please explain to Miss Mackenzie the new arrangements for her account?" The banker cleared his throat and consulted his notes with the careful attention of a man reading from a script he wanted to get exactly right. "Miss Mackenzie, Colonel Mitchell has purchased your mortgage debt in its entirety, along with an additional sum sufficient to fund improvements to your property and provide for your ongoing expenses. The terms of your new arrangement are considerably more favorable than your previous mortgage." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means," Bancroft continued, "that your monthly payment obligation has been reduced to $5, with no interest charges and no penalties for late payment. It also means that Colonel Mitchell has established a medical fund specifically for your treatment, to be administered by Dr. Edmund Hartwell in Denver City. Dr. Hartwell is considered one of the finest specialists in respiratory ailments west of Chicago." The room seemed to spin around Sarah as she tried to process information that seemed too good to be real. "Colonel Mitchell, I can't possibly accept such charity. It's too much, and I have no way to repay such generosity." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she could taste blood rising in her throat again. "It's not charity," Mitchell replied firmly. "It's an investment. I'm investing in the belief that good people deserve good things, and that sometimes a small act of kindness should be repaid with interest compounded over time. Your $5 a month will go into a fund for helping other people who find themselves in desperate circumstances through no fault of their own. You'll be helping me help others, which means your kindness will keep spreading long after both of us are gone." He reached across the desk and placed a gentle hand over hers. "But there's another condition to this arrangement, one that I consider non-negotiable. You are going to Denver City immediately to begin treatment with Dr. Hartwell. I have a carriage waiting outside that will take you to the train station, and there's a private compartment reserved on this afternoon's eastbound train. Dr. Hartwell is expecting you tomorrow morning." Sarah felt another coughing fit building, but this time she did not try to hide it. The blood came more freely than ever before, and she realized that without immediate medical attention, she might not survive another week in her current condition. "What about my land? My animals? I can't just abandon everything I have left." "Already arranged," Mitchell said. "I've hired the Williamson family to maintain your property while you're receiving treatment. They'll care for your livestock, tend your garden, and make necessary repairs to your cabin. When you're well enough to return, everything will be waiting for you, along with enough improvements to make the property profitable again." The magnitude of what was happening felt almost impossible to accept, but the taste of blood in her mouth reminded Sarah that she was in no position to refuse help, regardless of how overwhelming it might seem. "Why me?" she asked one final time. "Out of all the people you could have chosen to help, why did you pick a dying woman with nothing to offer in return?" Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and hard-won wisdom. "Because, Sarah Mackenzie, you reminded me that there are still people in this world who will share their last coins with a stranger. Because you showed me that genuine goodness still exists, even in the hardest of circumstances. And because sometimes the most important thing we can do with our wealth is to make sure that kind of goodness survives and prospers." He stood and helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her with surprising strength as another wave of weakness washed over her. "The carriage is waiting outside, and your train leaves in 2 hours. Dr. Hartwell has assured me that with proper treatment and care, your condition is far from hopeless. Many people have recovered completely from consumption when they receive appropriate medical attention in time." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she felt herself sinking back into her chair as the implications began to register. "But why?" she managed to ask. "Why the disguise? Why test me like that? And why are you here now?" "Because," Mitchell said quietly, "I've learned that money changes people, and not usually for the better. I've watched men I once respected become grasping and cruel when they thought there was profit to be made. I've seen women who were raised to be decent Christian ladies turn their backs on suffering when it became inconvenient to their social standing. After my wife died 5 years ago, I decided to find out whether there were still people in this territory who would show kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return." He gestured toward the documents spread across Bancroft's desk. "I've been traveling through small communities, presenting myself as a drifter or a down-on-his-luck prospector, looking for people who would offer help to someone who appeared to have nothing to give in return. In 3 years of testing, you are the first person who not only offered assistance but refused payment for it. The first person who chose generosity even when it meant taking food out of your own mouth." Sarah felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks, partly from relief and partly from the overwhelming realization of how close she had come to losing everything. "But I still don't understand what this means for my situation. The debt is still real, my land is still mortgaged, and I'm still dying of consumption. Your kindness doesn't change any of that." Mitchell smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, it was the smile of a man who held the power to change lives. "Actually, it changes all of it. Mr. Bancroft, would you please explain to Miss Mackenzie the new arrangements for her account?" The banker cleared his throat and consulted his notes with the careful attention of a man reading from a script he wanted to get exactly right. "Miss Mackenzie, Colonel Mitchell has purchased your mortgage debt in its entirety, along with an additional sum sufficient to fund improvements to your property and provide for your ongoing expenses. The terms of your new arrangement are considerably more favorable than your previous mortgage." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. What does that mean, exactly? It means, Bancroft continued, that your monthly payment obligation has been reduced to $5, with no interest charges and no penalties for late payment. It also means that Colonel Mitchell has established a medical fund specifically for your treatment, to be administered by Dr. Edmund Hartwell in Denver City. Dr. Hartwell is considered one of the finest specialists in respiratory ailments west of Chicago. The room seemed to spin around Sarah as she tried to process information that seemed too good to be real. Colonel Mitchell, I can't possibly accept such charity. It's too much, and I have no way to repay such generosity. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she could taste blood rising in her throat again. It's not charity, Mitchell replied firmly. It's an investment. I'm investing in the belief that good people deserve good things, and that sometimes a small act of kindness should be repaid with interest compounded over time. Your $5 a month will go into a fund for helping other people who find themselves in desperate circumstances through no fault of their own. You'll be helping me help others, which means your kindness will keep spreading long after both of us are gone. He reached across the desk and placed a gentle hand over hers. But there's another condition to this arrangement, one that I consider non-negotiable. You are going to Denver City immediately to begin treatment with Dr. Hartwell. I have a carriage waiting outside that will take you to the train station, and there's a private compartment reserved on this afternoon's eastbound train. Dr. Hartwell is expecting you tomorrow morning. Sarah felt another coughing fit building, but this time she did not try to hide it. The blood came more freely than ever before, and she realized that without immediate medical attention, she might not survive another week in her current condition. What about my land? My animals? I can't just abandon everything I have left. Already arranged, Mitchell said. I've hired the Williamson family to maintain your property while you're receiving treatment. They'll care for your livestock, tend your garden, and make necessary repairs to your cabin. When you're well enough to return, everything will be waiting for you, along with enough improvements to make the property profitable again. The magnitude of what was happening felt almost impossible to accept, but the taste of blood in her mouth reminded Sarah that she was in no position to refuse help, regardless of how overwhelming it might seem. Why me? She asked one final time. Out of all the people you could have chosen to help, why did you pick a dying woman with nothing to offer in return? Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and hard-won wisdom. Because, Sarah Mackenzie, you reminded me that there are still people in this world who will share their last coins with a stranger. Because you showed me that genuine goodness still exists, even in the hardest of circumstances. And because sometimes the most important thing we can do with our wealth is to make sure that kind of goodness survives and prospers. He stood and helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her with surprising strength as another wave of weakness washed over her. The carriage is waiting outside, and your train leaves in 2 hours. Dr. Hartwell has assured me that with proper treatment and care, your condition is far from hopeless. Many people have recovered completely from consumption when they receive appropriate medical attention in time.